Looks like we're just about ready to start. I see, oh good, we have our usual friends here and looks like a couple of new people. This is fantastic. Great.
Okay, well, would you like to begin?
Yeah, absolutely. So welcome everyone to this 6th week. As I already mentioned, we're doing the 6th quartet with this week. We're wrapping up our journey. We've come all the way through these quartets, and we've had all of you guys in our audience with us on this journey, learning these quartets. And it's been a tremendous pleasure for all around. So this week we have an incredible lineup, starting today with our fabulous guest, Gabriela Lena Frank. And we'll tell you more about that. And then of course our open rehearsal Friday at 1 o'clock Eastern, and our concert at 7:30 on Saturday. So why don't we get started? We can, we'll start. Ross, why don't you introduce Gabriela, and then we can go ahead straight into questions. I'll just remind the audience that as the discussion goes, please feel free to just jump in with your questions, either in the Q&A or the chat. We're going to be here to guide the conversation along and everything, but you know, we love the participation. So just chime right in. You guys always have great comments and great questions. So.
All right. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce Gabriela Lena Frank, a wonderful composer and somebody who's actually been kind of a part of the Tesla Quartet in a way since our very beginning. As a graduate student at Juilliard, when the group started, we actually premiered one of her pieces, a piano quintet, at a festival, a Focus Festival at Juilliard. And that was a lot of fun. So that was when we first met Gabriela. And over the years, we've been in contact and worked together. Last summer, a couple of us participated in a commissioning premiere project that she started. She runs the Gabriela Lena Frank Creative Music Academy, and Edwin and Michelle both premiered short works for their respective instruments by composers who were perhaps in a little bit of a financial need, but also I think in an artistic need to want to create as well. And so it was a really nice collaboration. And then she also nominated a handful of composers for our own commissioning project, and helped us with that as well, the Alternating Currents project, which you could check out on YouTube if you haven't seen that. So we're really excited. Thank you, Gabriela, for joining us today and for joining this discussion about Bartók. So I wanted to kick it off with a question for you about the folk music kind of side of Bartók's music. I know you've written a bit about Bartók's influence, but how has the Bartók's interest in folk music or folk music in general influenced your own creative voice as a composer?
Well, thank you. First, I should say thanks for having me. And Bartók is a topic that I can spend a lot of time talking about. So I'll try to keep it super focused and of interest. And bear in mind that I'm not a historian or a theorist. I'm a creative person. And so my view has always been how he sees my creative imagination, both as a pianist back in the day when I was still playing a lot, and continually as a composer. And it started before I really could articulate my own vision of what I wanted to do with my musical life. I was let's see, I was 19 years old, and the first time I played chamber music wasn't like for a lot of keyboardists, Mozart or Haydn or even some other composers. It was the Bartók contrasts, which is a trio for violin, piano, and clarinet. And I was 19 years old. I wasn't even a piano major. I was just a composer that wanted to play with, I wanted to have fun. And the fun seemed to be where all the performers were. And so I got to play with mostly string players. And so I was really well known to, say, Norman Fisher, who's a really wonderful, prominent cello teacher at Tanglewood, and Sergio Luca, when he was still teaching, Kenneth Goldsmith, Catherine Winkler. I mean, I went to school at Rice, which had this really dominant string department. So it was one of the string faculty that said, there's this crazy composer here, and none of the piano majors want to do this piece, so we have a violinist that needs to do this. And they put it together. And for the first time while I was in school, I mean, up to that point, it was like the music just leapt into my fingers. It was actually easy for me. And so I had just this very pure visceral reaction to the mixed meters, the really picturesque gestures, the colors, the violin up high, the clarinet down low, and the piano just coming in like this. I mean, things you don't see, everything else. And I struggled with Haydn. The passage work in Mozart just kicks my butt. But you give me like the rhythm and needing the voice chords, and I was a very accurate pianist. So it was like a computer game, getting everything. And then I could hear something about that this was evoking another land, another time, another world. It was like going into a sci-fi novel, and you're just lost, like with these different civilizations. And this was like the music of that civilization. So it caught me without my knowing who Bartók was. It really just caught me in this sort of primal, deep way. And then when I started reading about him over the coming years, I just got more and more obsessed, because I was looking for a hero, and I was looking for what my place was in classical music. I grew up in Berkeley in the 70s and 80s, listening to a lot of música folclórica, música andina, which is the culture of my mom. My mom's from Peru. And they met when my father, an Eastern European Jewish descendant, he's a second generation American on one side and first generation on the other, came through New York and the Bronx. I mean, I really know the New York Jewish culture very well, because we were very close to that side of the family growing up, not so close to the Peruvian side of the family. My parents met when he was a Peace Corps volunteer, and he brought back home a Peruvian bride, a lot of LPs in the 60s, when Peruvian music was exploding into the global forefront. Andean music, mountain music just took off. And so this was music. You see the guys in the colorful ponchos, and they're playing zampoña panpipes and charango guitars, and they're beating a drum, and it's really lyrical, and they often look very Indio, and they have a sort of a certain cast to their skin. My mother heard multiple languages in her household. She heard Spanish, but she also heard Quechua, and she also heard Cantonese, because there's a strong Chinese wing of the family. So you look at my mom, she looks bien China. She looks very Chinese, and her maiden name is a Chinese name. So I have a lot of different things going on in here. So when she would tell me stories about growing up in Peru, I had to go into my imagination. And then when the Peruanos and Bolivianos and people from Ecuador and Chile, they started coming out and giving concerts at La Peña, which was a South American folklore club in Berkeley. We could walk to those concerts if we wanted to. I saw people that looked like my mom playing this music, and there was like juice and cookies at intermission. I would see all the other Peruvians in the Bay Area there, and it was always joyous and happy. My mom singing along to some of the songs, and this music I could memorize quickly. I would remember it, and I would go back home, because we had a little spinet, and I would try and replicate what I heard. So I would see things like the charango, which is like a little ukulele guitar, and their fingers are all over the place. It's like watching a peepot player. They're just so agile. And I'll go to the piano and do the same thing. So a lot of my music that I write at the piano, it has a lot of repeated notes, no passage work. It's like repeated notes and chords and tremolo chords. We don't see a lot of that in the traditional vocabulary of piano music. But this was my panpipe. This was my charango, was this 88 keyboard monster. And I started to do what I'm doing now that I get paid for. That's my career. I was beginning that in my early years in this very joyful way. So given all that, when I got into the conservatory, and all of that is, from what I'm seeing in the vista, is streamlined out. There is no repertoire with those kinds of values. There's nobody that had been to those concerts. All my teachers are, as wonderful as most of them were, white, European, or American, one or two Asian instructors. So then here comes Bartók, and I play the music, and I'm in that same headspace as when I was listening to La Música Andina, and the virtuosity of it, but translated. It was the translation, how it came out different, how it came out in Hungary, Romania, Moldavia, I mean, all these places that he's been to, and then through the Bartók land of his imagination. I wanted to get there too. And I had finally a model. So the other thing that really impressed me about Bartók, that was very important to me, was seemingly impossible, unidiomatic things to do on the piano became idiomatic. And my clarinetist was complaining the same thing, and my violinist was complaining the same thing. That cadenza, I mean, there's so many awkward things in it, and there's so many awkward things in the piano. And I remember looking at later when I started learning the solo sonata, this is a few years later, I was a grad student. There's one passage I remember where, because he was a pianist, he could put his own fingerings, suggestions and pedalings and whatnot. And yeah, there's one where it would be so much easier to do it like a scale, one fingering following another. But he wants you to do it like with your thumb. I'm going, what? This is just stupid. I'm not going to do this. Right, well, I'll try it. I worked with him for a few weeks, and it got the sound that you wanted. He was right. So that caught me too. When composers can X-ray into the score and speak through your instrument, and they can speak to what your instrument can do beyond your imagination, that's magical. To me, that's genius, that kind of foresight. So I remember when I was playing the contrast in one of my coachings, it kind of blurted out, and I said something like, he was Latino in a previous life. And because everything, if it spoke to me, must be Latino. Of course, it didn't have to be Latino, but that was the bar that I set. And since he was obviously not Latino-Americano, he was in a previous life, he must have been. I still wanted to own it. And I learned that we were kindred spirits, from a different father and a different mother and a different continent, that this was family for me. So I got obsessed. And all through my school years, I started reading everything I could about him. There's more scholarship now. I read his writings and essays. And fortunately for me, my second piano teacher, I had really wonderful piano teachers. My second one was himself a Bartók scholar. So he could tell me more and play me some of the recordings that he found that Bartók was perhaps inspired by. And he was one of the ones that encouraged me to go to Latin America at that point. And for the first time in my life, I started traveling in South America. I was in my mid-20s. And I realized that it wasn't enough to just kind of play. I have to pay tribute to his vision, his work, by starting to do my own work in this vein. And this also points up to some of the differences between me and Bartók, not only a different era and a different continent, but the fact that these cultures weren't just a few miles away like they were for Bartók. They were within his country. And there are so many levels of invisibility sometimes within cultures that I had to actually go into my mother's homeland and confront. The first time I went to Peru, it was a really difficult trip. It didn't occur to me to get my Spanish up, and my Spanish was okay. My accent's great, but okay, only because I just didn't use it. And I got sick from everything. It felt like the land was rejecting me. I got sick from the food and the water, and the sun was too hot. And I got tired because the air didn't have enough oxygen. I was such a gringa there. And all my cousins, my mom comes with a very large family. It's like 14 children. So we were the exotic wing. Me and my brother were the exotic wing of the Peruvian family. And so that was really overwhelming. Bartók was abstract, creative, but abstract. I'm looking at my cousin who looks like me. That's not abstract. It's reminding me that I really do have this lineage. I really do have this culture. And I got hooked. I mean, after that first trip, I've gone back so many times over, especially over a period of about 15, 16 years. And each of these trips I've been with my mom. My first trip, I went with a book of Bartók essays in one hand and National Geographic like travel essays in the other hand. And I was trying to imitate, because that's all I knew. I wasn't a musicologist by training. So Bartók talked about going into a village, wanting the oldest musicians, because they were like the most authentic petitioners, right? They didn't become charlatans playing for coins in the cities. And we have that in Latin America, like play the gringos. You know, the Andean mountain women is really cold. They don't wear short skirts. Just put on a short skirt, because that's what they do on the coast. You know, I mean, you see that. So Bartók, it was amazing for me to have parallels. I could see it. You know, he was really observing something timeless about how human beings handle culture and class and race. And I had to translate it, but I was seeing it. But some of the advice was not good for me. Especially in the National Geographic essay, I remember, you always get like a man and he's like a great traveler and he's going to go find a bar or a pub or a tavern and get a sense of the lay of the land, find out things from the locals. It means a very different thing when a young woman goes by herself into some of these places. And I learned really quickly. And for a while, my mom and I, when we went together, we were going into little casitas de belleza, beauty houses, beauty salons. And we get our nails done, or maybe our hair shampooed, and then we find out what interesting things are happening, because these things are not necessarily advertised. So when we would go to Peru, we would just land there and then figure out where we wanted to go. We might choose a part. Are we going to go to the Cordillera Blanca up in the north, which is like the White Mountains, the highlands? Are we going to go to Cajamarca? This is where the Spaniards wiped out the Incas. We're going to go down south to the Arequipa, very beautiful, mountainous, stay on the coast, and a lot of amazing archaeological digs. So I started to really get stories going. And I think a difference that I have from Bartók, because it's just my journey, has been that I bring in mythology in a very overt way often. My dad's a Mark Twain scholar, so I think I had no choice but to bring in like stories and narrative, and I like people feeling like they're in a different landscape, have a story, but leave room for them to fill out the rest of the story. You don't want to dictate too much. It's not a soundtrack. And Bartók set me on that journey too, for many reasons. So he's been a guiding light for decades.
And so in terms of the absorbing the musical, the kind of musical traditions of Peru, was that kind of a general absorption just from hearing it and experiencing it, or did you also write it down or copy it, or kind of work in a more tangible way to collect this type of material, or was it a little more ephemeral, just like the experience of it and then the memory of how it sounded?
That's a great question. I did both. And I think when I first went in, I was more technical, but I couldn't help but not be technical when I was learning about my family. And then it became more emotional and more like a storyteller, just absorbing and re-envisioning, in a more metaphorical sense. And I think along the way, I went deeper and deeper in that, even though, I mean, I got very technical about it, and I still am. You'll see me like transcribe or record. And as I became more and more aware of cultural appropriation and rights and those kinds of things, as I went deeper into this, I started, I would say, staying more in the imaginative part of it, and realized that, hey, I'm not a musicologist. I discovered what ethnomusicology was, and that the kinds of transcriptions I was doing was really amateur. If you compare them to now the people that I know the scholars that are doing work in Peru. And one of my best friends is a scholar at UC Davis of Peruvian dance, a dance anthropologist. And I see what she does. I'm like, that's not me. So let's find where I can go deep. So it may have started more technical, And it's still technical when I want to get down. God, I need a spectrograph. I got to figure out what that intonation is. I don't get it. I want to know what it is and try and get a hint of it into, say, a symphony or a Western orchestra. I find those solutions when I become creative, not technical, if that makes sense. And I feel like sometimes when we talk about the trajectory of Bartók, we have these phases that he went through. It was super technical, just writing down things. And then the things got more complicated where he was slowing down the record in order to get, okay, it's like a dotted 128th to a 256. He's like got all these bar lines, beam lines to figure out what it is. And if he could have worked richly with microtone, I think he would have put that in all over the place. And but he went a different direction. He was really looking at the rhythm, I think, of it. And then he started to write music that could be straight up gypsy music, folkloric music. And then he started going into, whoa, what is this guy smoking? It's like Bartók land. This is some imaginative landscape. So I think I went there more quickly in a certain way because I didn't feel like I could write 10,000 highland tunes from Peru before I knew something about Northern Peruvian culture. And Bartók held himself to this kind of standard. He was also, maybe this is romantic of me, but I feel like he was trying to rescue the music at a time when Europe was such a dangerous place. And when these people were so vulnerable and identity is vulnerable, he saw what Franco did in Spain. He made it illegal to sing traditional Spanish folkloric music. And a lot of it was wiped out. It's lost forever. And you have some people that try to go back and rescue it by talking to the elders. So I was fortunate to grow up at a time where I didn't have this kind of war as the backdrop of my young adult life.
It's so interesting that you're talking about this idea of preservation, because when we were talking with Daniel Hamar, who in his turn as a musician, as an instrumentalist, would also travel to villages and learn from local musicians. He was talking to us how this music is dying, and how even before Bartók's time, there was this idea that unless you preserve it somehow, it could be lost. And you touched up on the subject of cultural appropriation, and I thought you put it very beautifully. Where it really depends what you do with this music and how you present this music, where it kind of becomes perhaps a cultural appropriation versus really preserving and really celebrating it. I'm curious if you would speak a little bit more about that sort of thin line.
Yeah, this is obviously this is a really sensitive subject, and people don't draw the lines in the sand in the same place as to when, well, you've gone too far, or how do you demonstrate celebration, a tribute that's respectful and joyous. And I think tributes that are too polite, that don't go far enough. I have people of color, for instance, that want to bring in something of a non-Western culture, and they're so scared to get into the music that they basically just do a transcription and it doesn't sing. And I said, you know what? It's not impolite to put yourself into it. And it's going to be scary because when you're in it, you don't know if it's going to turn out good or not. You don't know if it's going to feel authentic or it's going to feel like a tourist vision. And you may write some pieces that fail, and that's part of the process. And the kind of pain that you feel is a good one to know. And this is how you will learn. I wrote some awful pieces that will never see the light of day. I might sell on eBay one day for a lot of money in my old age, but for the moment, they will never see the light of day because it was like a nachos commercial sing-song. It was just so bad. But that is part of the process. And so there has to be a kind of audaciousness and respect. They shouldn't cancel one another out. And I think Bartók's music is super audacious. It's so virtuoso. It's so brilliantly orchestrated. It's so him. Nobody else sounds like him. There's a lot of bad knockoffs, but he does Bartók. Bartók does Bartók. And it's because he was secure in how learned he was, the sense of mission. So it wasn't about cultural appropriation, trying to make money. He died penniless, and as a refugee. I'm not saying you have to suffer in order to be authentic, but you don't know until you see it. And it's not like you settle the question and then you just go. That's the other thing. You have to be comfortable with shadow boxing with this for the rest of your life. And especially now, look at this year that we just had in 2020 and what's still going on. We can't stop. These are questions that have to be continually held again and again, whether through words or through our music making. I think it's incumbent upon us to keep it present the way Bartók did.
Very fascinating. You mentioned I just wanted to circle back to something you said about translating the sort of challenges that Bartók had translating music into, or transposing it or translating it. And you were also describing challenges that you had and experimenting with microtonality and things like that, getting the right scale or the right sound. My question is, it seems clear to me that Bartók struggled. Part of the struggle was the fact that he had this staff and he had 12 notes, and it was like there's kind of a lot of fixed stuff in place, and he had to try to create a sound world out of these kind of confines that would sound authentic in one respect, in a certain respect. Do you feel the same confinement, or do you move out of it? Do you just take the staff away and make people read something else? I mean, how do you cope with that challenge in trying to express music that obviously can't be expressed in just like a 12-note sort of normal Western style approach?
Yeah, and I would say it's not just like pitches and rhythms, like what's on the score. I would also say it's physicalities. And some people would say quarter tone, like trying to get in tune is like a physicality as well. Your fingers don't want to go there. You have to really translate, like move your fingers around in a certain way. But I was mentioning the repeated note thing that I do now, because I've been doing this since I was 5. Like I don't get tired, and I can like temper it and go faster, and then I can pick up grace notes, and it will seem like it's just going straight through. And I can do it in my left hand too, in my weaker hand. But pianists can sometimes be like, oh my God, I don't know how I'm going to do it. Can I just play some passage work? And so I will give them like cheat tips on how to relax or how to take things with the left hand and then come back in with your right hand. So to just kind of play with it. And this kind of thing is very common in Latin America. Another thing that's common in Latin America are hockets. So hockets are, for those that may not be familiar, it's when you have a melody, could be super simple. Maybe it's like Mary Had a Little Lamb. Da-da-da-da-da-da-dum. So if Edwin were to sing dum, and then Ross were to sing dum, and then Seraphim was to sing and then Michelle sings another note, and between all of them, they'll stitch it together. So everybody's popping in with their note, and it could like be in irregular places. Doesn't have to be like something where they just count and they come in on the 1 each time. It could be 1, sometimes it could be 1.5. This was done because they split their instruments. You look at the panpipes, one player might have 5 notes and the other player might have 6. Between them, they construct a scale, but they'll split it in. The way they read music, if they read music, they'll read one line. Instead of separate lines for each person, they read one line and they just know who's taking what note. Not only that, they can go super fast. They can speed up and slow down, and nobody's like on each other's heels. It is perfect. They're so in sync, and they can do it without looking at each other. So this is amazing, but they would be amazed at things that we learn to do in our culture. And I have had some experiences. I brought in this one great experience I had back in 2014. My alma mater gave me and a couple other Michigan alums, I went to University of Michigan, quite a bit of money to bring in some Ecuadorian musicians I knew that play these traditional instruments with a string quartet. And for 10 days, we just tried all kinds of things. I wrote music. I arranged some of my string quartets inspired by Peruvian music with them in mind. And we were constantly like intimidating one another and amazing one another with the things that we could do or couldn't do that we had spent decades doing. It was a beautiful experience because you have to get out of your own head. You have to like get your own ego out of it, whether you could do something or not. So I find it easier for me to make a greater ask of myself and of musicians with the non-Western evocation of indigenous music in chamber music than I do in the symphony world. And it often has to do with the kind of more intimate dialogue. Look, we could do things like this. I can just say, you know, Ross, can I check something with you? Is this possible? Like, how expensive is this in terms of practice time? Can you get this in about an hour or just like 10 hours? Totally unrealistic, you know, or if I situate the Hocket like this, why would I want to do Hocket when just say Seraphim can do the whole line? Why do I want to bring another? I'll say, okay, you know why? Because each note is an artificial harmonic. There's no way that Seraphim could do each of those. And you're going to get this amazing sound. And I did that in one of my string quartets. Artificial harmonic, you can't pop around super, super fast on that. But you could like stitch together a line and it sounds like a panpipe. So I have to be super strategic. I'm constantly finding, it's like a dilemma, a challenge. I'm constantly finding what are my resources? What's the skill set of my musicians this year? Because we keep getting more adventurous all the time. I sometimes look at European composers exploring avant-garde techniques. Sciarrino is a great one. Scotonibio, Lackaman, all of these guys, because they do stuff that sounds like the creaky effects, the rusty, broken sounds that you find in indigenous instruments. So you find all of these avant-garde sounds already within the culture. So I'm constantly translating. Now I'm a little bit Western, now I'm sometimes indigenous, now it's avant-garde, now it's like easy peasy, Mary had a little lamb, you know, and I'm always in overguard. So it's not just, you're mentioning, Edwin, you're mentioning like the 12 notes and the quarter tones. That's one of the major areas. The rhythm, the feel. How do you notate the feel? You sit back on a beat. How much of retard? Not just how much. How great do I hold back on retard and then let it go? I mean, there's the way you hold back on retard and let it go might tell somebody you're in northern Peru or southern Peru. So it's and also, do you want to be completely literal? What if I take the spirit of that and I say, okay, I'm going to like change the retard because you're now in Gabriela land. You're stepping into this, at the passport into my imagination. These are the parameters I'm setting up. It's kind of like Lord of the Rings. You know, these languages came from a culture, right? But he did his own stuff with it. Or Game of Thrones, same thing. They made up a whole different cartography for Europe that doesn't really exist. I think composers shine when they have the D.M.A, but then look at the resources before them. It's an unending game that I play, you know.
Yeah, it's so fascinating and imaginative how to take all these different elements and then make something new and personal and unique. Yeah, I think that's definitely something you and Bartók share. That's quite obvious. And you were mentioning something before when we were talking about the preservation of the music, and you mentioned, you know, how Franco banned, you know, you couldn't speak Catalan or sing traditional songs in Spain, and you know, and I'm sure Bartók was confronted with a lot of this, you know, in his homeland and across Europe. And you can hear in the sixth quartet some kind of cultural or political commentary coming through. I mean, the march in the second movement is kind of poking fun at the goose-stepping soldiers and the kind of raucous nature of the burletta in the third movement. Do you address, you know, in a similar way, any type of cultural or political statements in your music? I mean, does that come through at all, or do you tend to kind of keep it a little bit more?
I think it's
or less
implied.
along those lines?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it was implied. Well, I felt like it was implied always when I got started, that there was something political in the music I was going to write, just because I was doing something with indigenous music in a revered format like the string quartet. I have a lot of string quartet music because, again, I played so much music with string players, not very much with wind players. I don't, my wind player friends are like, E, when are you going to get something for us? And so I mean, it's an intimidating repertoire, but for me, it wasn't. And so I did feel there was something audacious when I was in my 20s by saying, this is what I think the string quartet can evoke. And it was music of the poor people, the indigenous people, who in many parts of Latin America are even lower on the ladder than the African-American population, that they're the slave culture. So lately, in looking back, I remember in 2017, so this was the first year of the new presidency, which I found really troubling. And in 2016, when the results of the election came out, I got writer's block for the first time in my life. And I just felt very uncertain about what the next few years were going to be like. And what helped me break out of the writer's block was the sense of mission, I think, saying, here I am. So I'm a daughter of a Jew. I'm a daughter of a woman from a SHITHOLE country. I'm an overeducated West Coast liberal elite. I'm an artist. I'm a woman. I'm disabled. I'm partially deaf. So I'm like, I belong, to that group that's been vilified this past year. And something about that made me mad in a good way. And I just broke out, and I had my biggest year. I had this enormous premieres. I mean, these were set up, but so the first premiere was my big requiem, my Conquest Requiem. I decided it's going to be called Conquest Requiem. And I have my longtime collaborator, Nilo Cruz, who came over from Cuba and has the same kind of issue, what's political, what's not. And it's about the story of Malinche, who was Cortez's concubine. Cortez took out the Aztecs from Spain. And there was an indigenous woman, imagine this, an indigenous woman who was watching continents clash. And she was Cortez's concubine, but also a translator. She was Mayan. She spoke Mayan, the language of the Aztecs, Nahuatl, and picked up Spanish when the Jesuits came over. So it's a requiem told through her eyes. So it celebrates femalehood. It celebrates indigenous witnessing. And so that's a pretty bold work, and it was premiered in a red state as well by a major orchestra. Then after that, I had a Carnegie Hall premiere with Marin Alsop, another symphony, another orchestral work called Apu, which is Quechua. So it's like indigenous voices here, Carnegie Hall, orchestral work, major conductor. I mean, everything's in there. I have a big publisher too, so of course they were promoting it like crazy. And then I had, oh my God, forgot, how could I forget? My huge concerto for orchestra was premiered with Detroit. And it's this big, it's a concerto for orchestra. It's like super virtuoso. They killed it, but they were, really working hard at it. And the last movement is this big indigenous parade with whistles and drums.
Was that a nod to, was it a nod to Bartók as a concerto for orchestra? Because, obviously that's one of the.
There are a couple little hints, a couple little almost quotes. I would call them like paraphrases, and then they go away. But and there are moments for sections to shine, like what he does too. I love the concerto for orchestra format. It feels a little bit more like chamber music to me, with that. Then I went the other way, and I had a 30-minute solo violin suite that was premiered in like 8 movements. I love Bach too. I love that format, but I wanted to grapple with all of these formats. So to me, that was political. It was political, even if there might not be mocking the goose stepping of soldiers or other things like that. Earlier in my career, I did have one work that my mother did not want me to do. And it took me about 10, 12 years before I figured out how to comment on this. I kept thinking about it. And it's a symphonic work called Mancha Tiempo that Seattle Symphony premiered maybe 2006. My career was just beginning to move then. And I wanted to do something about Sendero Luminoso. Sendero Luminoso means shining path in English. And it's a terrorist group in Peru that's unfortunately starting to come back to life again. And it's got this sort of perverted Maoist delivery of its philosophies, super violent in the 80s from that side, but also from the government side to suppress it. I mean, it was just really awful time for my family there. And I didn't know how to comment on it. My career is beginning to move. I was worried about, like the impact of this. And my mother said, "Are you crazy? You shouldn't be doing that. I mean, they'll put you on their hit list. This is what they do. They look at people that are criticizing these kinds of things." So what I did instead was, it took me about 10 years to get this. It's a tone poem of a dream that I had when I was a little girl, of my mother and women that look like my mom running from danger. There's that kind of nebulous, just fear and danger. And I kept hearing the words mancha dempo. So something slightly different, mancha dempo. And I didn't know what that was. It was like nonsense words for a kid. When I was in college, I saw a documentary about Sendero Luminoso, and I heard the term mancha tiempo, which means time of fear. And I saw images from my dream. And this was a documentary that had come out. It was a news piece when I was a little girl. And I realized I took that into my dream. I forgot its origin. And this was my way of processing. So something that happens on another continent can still trickle over to a daughter of an immigrant who grows up with advantages and safety. And that was the comment about how we're interconnected. And I think that might be the most overtly, I guess, political or some sort of commentary. Again, I think I draw a lot of mythology, and lately I've been writing more about the climate crisis. Being here in fire country, which has really been devastating for my state of California, has impacted my career, like not being able to go to premieres, and we have 2 properties here, protecting our property. I think it's the greatest challenge that we face as a humankind. And of course, climate crisis has hit Latin America very hard. And I believe the pandemic is a sign of environmental distress, as most health epidemics are. And talking about that's still very uncomfortable for people, and the lifestyle changes that are needed, especially for us musicians with flying. It's just really, really tough how to support what we do. And so I feel like that's a political stance, and have introduced a climate crisis component to my academy that is for emerging composers that the 4 of you have interfaced with as well. We have a project called Composing Earth, which is a 2-year commitment for the composer. In the first year, in a monthly study group, we read books, and we meet up and talk about the issues, and I kind of coach them on how to renegotiate their contracts. And in the second year, they write a piece of music for a great group, and we commission it. And they range from orchestral to solo pieces to electronics, and we have 10 a year. That's kind of political. So Bartók wasn't writing about the climate crisis per se, but the climate crisis was already happening then. Poverty is often, and class is dictated sometimes by this type of crisis. So politics can mean a lot of different things.
Yeah, and I think something that sounds common between what you're describing and what we take away from Bartók is that interconnectedness that you described, because I think that's something that Bartók also was trying to communicate to some extent, that there's something that we have to share, something we have to learn from each other in order to share, in order to find that interconnectedness. It's very important, very powerful. And I mean, and we have to thank you for all your hard work that you're doing in that respect, because it's bringing attention to something that is truly dire for the world.
Yeah, well, I think what you were saying earlier about your, sort of acting by doing versus acting by just putting up some sort of a political statement, that actually speaks volumes and speaks even more than actual, sometimes misleading type of statements. So really, it's really wonderful to get your very unique look into Bartók's world, and we really wanted to talk with a composer such as yourself to see what is it like to sort of get connected to somebody like that and sort of embrace it, and then in a way channel and sort of continue the legacy of the Bartók. So we just couldn't be more thankful for your time and your agreeing to talk with us.
And yeah, I think, please, any of the attendees who are watching, if you have questions, type them out, and we're happy to, always happy to answer what might be on your mind.
As people are slowly getting more brave to actually ask somebody, can I just quickly ask you, Gabriela, what's on the works for you? What are you excited about? Is there anything in particular that you are finishing up, perhaps, and something that people can check out?
Well, I just turned in some work, and I'm looking ahead now to getting back into work for my first opera. And this will be with the Los Angeles Opera, which was of course, interrupted by COVID and everything else. So that would be a big project coming up. We just decided the fellows for the next round of our academy. And I'm super, they are so talented and they're so interesting. And I just want to work with them all like yesterday. And so the whole academy experience I never planned on doing an academy. And that was something that came, I was mentioning, the last presidency, which was very troubling for me, came about because of that. And I was firmly in my freelance career and wasn't really enchanted by a lot of offers that were coming in from, say, conservatories and academia. So we are about to accept the next wave of fellows, and then we have some exciting projects connecting them with commissions and trying to give them the kind of boost that I didn't necessarily have, but I found luck in other ways. I want them to be lucky. And I feel like we can help make them lucky in that way. And then also, just like with everybody else, all the other projects are beginning to go back in our calendar. And it's like, you know how it is. It's like, who can do January? Okay, I can't. Okay, I gotta go back to this one. Can you do December? Can you do this like this and get back in queue? No, we're gonna cut the queue. And it's just dance that we're gonna be in for the next like 6 months. And I'm sure the four of you are doing the same thing as well. So I have a lot of orchestral music that's coming up. And I have some anxiety because my first love is chamber, is actually chamber music. And I still don't have my big book of solo piano sonatas. I grew up on the Beethoven sonatas, so I thought I was going to have like 2 big volumes of that by now. And then I love all the Bach suites, so I thought I was going to have like 6 for cello and however many for violin and hit the viola. I thought I was going to have all of this. And I have like 2 piano sonatas, which is pretty pitiful. And so I'm trying to figure out, okay, I don't need to be hustling all the time like my young guns. My composers can do that. I need to really just pick now that each project is big and topical and really going to land and here to stay. And I turned 49 later this year. So I think about that. Wow, I have gravitas now. As soon as you can say that you're anywhere near the half-century mark, you're here. And so I'm determined to hit 100 because I want to see us come through the climate crisis. I want to see, my composers start getting gray hairs. I want to see if I can write maybe 3 operas. I'll be happy with 3 operas, maybe another requiem. So I got to hit 100 if I want to see all that stuff done. And we seem to have a question
That's
here.
right. Yeah, we do have a question. You can see it from your end, right? The question from Sonia. If you want, I'll read it out loud so everybody, all the attendees can hear. If I can pull up my chat, here it is. So we have a wonderful question from Sonia. Gabriela, do you have a favorite composition? And do you have one that you have can you think of a composition that you think is neglected unfairly?
Well, it's that I have a bunch of reactions. First, I don't really have favorites. It's kind of like asking from your kids. And even the pieces that other people find their favorite may not necessarily be mine, which I think is a really interesting situation to be in. Sometimes something's my favorite because even if it's not my best work, it taught me so much to do. Like it made me such a better composer to go into the piece at one level and come out on the other side with some skill sets or the beginning of something developing. And some of my rougher pieces are like that. I really realized something through the process, and about being neglected unfairly is kind of I don't know if I'm entitled to to feel like pieces need to be played a certain amount of time or whatnot, but I will advocate for, believe it or not, especially as a piano and string centric composer in many ways, for my piccolo concerto, which a few years ago I never would have thought I would have said, because this happened, oh gosh, maybe 10, 12, 13 years ago. I got my first top 5 orchestra commission. And it's not like now. Now things are changing where orchestras are saying, oh, we got to be more inclusive. Let's include more living voices. And so things have changed very quickly. And 10, 12 years ago, they weren't doing that so readily with somebody outside of the box in terms of demographics. So my agent said, hey, I got great news for you. And Cleveland Orchestra just reached out. And I was like, whoa, that's like a Rolls Royce orchestra. They can do anything, right? And then she said, okay, wait, don't get too excited. It's a piccolo concerto they want. And I was like, what? I said, oh no, not my first top. I'm not gonna do well, Can we do something like violin? Can piano? And she said, no, this is it. There's no negotiating, just piccolo concerto. You can have a big orchestra if you want, but just piccolo. So I actually said no. And I said, I'm gonna have to be brave, that they'll come back, or I'll just wait another few years and another one will come along. And so when I said no, I'm sure that was very surprising, because although I was starting to get known, I wasn't like super established. And then the piccolo player herself came and wrote me an email. And I'm going to give you a tip. That's the way to get a composer, by the way, is just to send a heartfelt email, what you heard of theirs that you just caught. And especially if you're a piccolo player, mention one of her string quartets. She heard one of my string quartets and said, the piccolo players need that. They need, I forget which one, maybe Milagros. We need Milagros, or whatever she heard. And I was like, my heart just went like that. And I said, okay. And I said, but you have to like workshop this with me if we're gonna do this. And so I was so dreading it that I waited to the last minute. I had gotten disciplined by this time. I wasn't doing that anymore, but I did it again. I was so dreading it. And I wasn't super confident yet about my orchestrational skills. Again, most of my experience at this point was chamber music. So I started working on it, and then I got insecure and I used the MIDI playback, which I hardly ever do. Even today, I'll use it from time to time, but I'm so glad I did, because when I listened to it, I started laughing. It was so goofy sounding and so horrible. I started cracking up at how bad my own music was. And I was thinking, oh my God, it sounds like I didn't keep the piccolo character in my head. I had violin. So it sounded like a piccolo trying to play Sibelius or Tchaikovsky, and just trying, like little Jiminy Cricket, trying to be like romantico and big. And I said, oh my God, it's like putting on grown-up clothes and makeup on a little girl. It just looks really goofy. So I started over and I was spot checking every 5 measures with the MIDI, just listening to it. And then I checked with her. And took risks with the orchestration, stuff that didn't sound good in the MIDI, and it's one of my strongest pieces. It ended up being one of my best pieces. It's it draws on a fairy tale. It really shows off the piccolo. And here's the last part. I had an amazing piccolo player, and they're coming to fore now. You really have to pay attention to what they can do. It's not an awful, harsh, painful sound. You can hear color.
707345428
Sorry about that. That's my backup band. You can hear color. You can hear everything else, you know, when you have a really good player.
Do we have more questions now? If not, I have actually one question. If I'm allowed to ask one question, would be, you know, from this whole process of learning six and performing six during pandemic and this year onwards, one thing I'm really learning is that how misunderstood the Bartók's music was, how misunderstood he was for many composers and many performers. So as an established composer yourself, is there like a one thing that you can advise to people who's not been exposed to Bartók's music yet, or have some sort of a fear maybe, or some sort of a filter to his music? Is there something that you can help them out? A few words.
It's a really great question. I feel like you guys have encountered this. It sounds like a question from experience, you know, trying to get reluctant people, you know. First of all, it's incredible that somebody born in 1881 died in 1945, you know, 80 years ago. It's still so modern and contemporary sounding, you know. I think part of the challenge with Bartók is how compressed it can be. You know, there's a lot happening, and he may want you to retard in just like 6 beats, you know, and it's just, it's very compressed music in many ways, and compressed vertically too, where there's a lot to unpack. And first of all, us performers, we can really phrase stuff. And if you listen to how Bartók plays his own piano music, he goes a little bit beyond, you know, if something's retarded, it's like really, if it's fermata, he really waits. It's just that, you know, all that stuff we can do to make things really clear. He's also voicing within his 10 fingers. So he's bringing out notes. There's the incredible recording of him playing the sonata for 2 pianos percussion with his second wife. He's also cheating. He's not playing all the notes everywhere. And I remember I was going like, what? I'm sweating over this, trying to do everything. And he'd actually, but it's not so much cheating. He knows he's strategic. He can lighten up on some of the fingers, and then he can phrase, and it's not thick sounding anymore. So for us, that's what we can do. Then I saw a masterclass in this, in the piano teacher I mentioned. His name is Logan Skelton, still teaching over in Michigan. Incredible artist, a composer as well, wonderful teacher. I watched him give a talk about Bartók to a group of these elderly women in sort of this genteel part of Michigan, not too far from Ann Arbor, school teachers that are teaching Clementi and little Ecosse and E flat, you know, I mean, little things like that. I was like, oh my God, they're going to be too polite to like boo him, but like, you're going to play like the sonata for them, or the Barbara Allegro, and I mean, some of these others that are really crunchy. And I watched what he did. First of all, he's super charismatic, super handsome. They probably thought he looked like their son, you know, so that doesn't hurt, right? And I mean, he's a performer. You know how to like bring in your audience. It's this kind of charisma that you exude. And then he started with Bartók's Juvenilia. He started with Baby Bartók. He started off with the little pieces he wrote. He played some recordings, and he brought them on. And when you temper something a little, you know, little by little, a little more dissonant, a little more rhythm, woo, it's like kind of thrilling. And they were totally into it. So again, it was the performer that I saw taking charge, who probably went through this experience of people not loving this music that he had committed his life to. So I'm going to say, you know, to people, whether it's Bartók or somebody else, is just like with anything else that took time, whether it's wine or eggplant or, you know, this weird esoteric filmmaker, you know, you can grow to love most things. And you can now find the just super charismatic educators and lovers of these different art forms to break it down well. Just like with anything else, is to give it a chance. And then your level of x-raying into the music will probably depend on whether you read music or you're visceral. You need to go to a physical in-person performance. You can't get it through Zoom, or you need 10 times with just one interpretation. And then you can appreciate the other interpretation because the differences really stand out in relief. It's like a shock, you know. There are different strategies for that. You have to kind of own your own listening experience and know, and we have to kind of own our own delivery and advocate well for the people that we believe in.
That's an awesome thing to hear. That's great. Yeah, it's kind of like, you know, looking at Picasso's work, later work versus early work. It's just, you know, you see the whole scope of the artist's growth, and yeah, it's roller coaster, isn't it? It's life, right? So no, I like that, what you just said. This is really helpful. Any more questions?
I can admit to leaving out a couple notes in some of the quartets that are just a little too awkward.
Oh, I'm guilty. Totally guilty. Yep. Tell me about it. Okay. All right. Well, if there is no more question, we thank you so much for joining in for the quartet. So appreciate it. I am so sorry I'm late, but yes, just it. Ross, you want to close up?
Sure. Yes. Thank you very much, Gabriela, on behalf of the quartet, for sharing your experience and your stories, and telling us about your music in addition to Bartók's. I think being a proponent of living composers and of music that is still alive but in a context you might not be aware of is really important. And thank you for championing the music that you do and bringing it to life with such vitality. A little redundant to say it that way, but I really do feel that there's so much of that in your music and in Bartók's music. And I think kindred spirits, as you pointed out earlier, is the perfect way to describe your connection. And for our attendees, just one final reminder. On Friday at 1 p.m., we will have a virtual open rehearsal where we will be working on some bits of the Sixth Quartet, which you can then watch in our live stream on Saturday at 7:30 p.m. And these are all Eastern Daylight Time. You will get email links like you always do. If you're new, just seeing this for the first time, where have you been for the last 6 weeks? But also you can go to teslaquartet.com and follow the links to sign up to receive all these emails if you haven't. And then one final plug, because for most of this series, we have been creating all of this content out of the goodness of our hearts with the love that we have for Bartók's music. So if you would consider supporting this project or potentially future projects along these lines, we would greatly appreciate it. You can also find a donation button on our website, teslaquartet.com. So thank you once again, Gabriela, for joining us tonight, and good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you all. Thank you, Gabriela.